As we near the completion of what has become known as the American century, one of the most remarkable stories of our nation has been the sea change in the roles of American women. At the turn of the 20th century, the vast majority of women worked at home. Today, nearly half of the country's females are an integral part of the workforce. A shift of this magnitude is unprecedented in history, but it did not happen easily or overnight.
Not the church, not the state. Women will decide our fate.
From the time of the founding of our nation, women have fought for their rights, their positions, their achievements in every segment of society.
The status quo must go.
When we stop them from dividing us along race lines and gender lines and geography, when we come together.
Those who succeeded have done so with more difficulty than most men. Today, women are on their way to being the sought-after equal partners in American society. This is the story of the women's movement in America, how it began, the people who shaped its course, the events that defined its missions. The story begins at the time of the Revolutionary War, with one of America's most persuasive champions of the rights of women, Abigail Adams. The year was 1776. Members of the Continental Congress were meeting in Philadelphia to frame the Declaration of Independence. The American colonies were about to separate from England, and war was not far away. One of the leaders of the revolution was John Adams of Massachusetts, a respected lawyer and legislator, and a future president of the United States. His wife Abigail was in Boston, warning him about the British movements.
John basically sort of fled Massachusetts and went down to Philadelphia for the First and Second Continental Congresses, and it was then that Abigail remained in Boston and wrote constantly, sneaking letters out so the British wouldn't get them, about what was happening.
He would write to her and say, I want to hear your thoughts. I want to see what you think. And even when they disagreed, he still wanted her opinion because he knew she was the only one he could trust. And he knew that Abigail had a great political acuity, so he would ask for her advice.
The prevailing social philosophy of the age was called the Enlightenment, which maintained that reason could triumph over poverty and oppression, and that a society of citizens could be enlightened through public education. But in the 18th century, only men could be citizens, and the natural rights of liberty and equality, so eloquently referred to in the American Declaration of Independence, were available only to free men, not to slaves or women.
Late 18th century women in England and in the new United States had almost no rights. Once married, a woman lost all rights to property. If she had inherited property, it went automatically to her husband, and he could use it. It might technically belong to her, but she had no right to control it, and he could do anything he wanted with it.
But Abigail Adams believed things should be different. An educated and cultured woman, she believed that women should have equal rights under the law, and knew the value that women could add to the political dialogue of the nation. In 1777, as the men were drafting America's laws in Philadelphia, Abigail wrote to her husband one of the most famous and enduring documents of the women's movement.
I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
These women, women of the educated middle class, that were the first to demand to have a public voice, who had the education and the opportunity to be able to express themselves, to form opinions, to write in public. So it was from this class that you would get women speaking for women's rights and an enlargement of women's roles.
Yet as enlightened as John Adams was for his time, and as much regard as he obviously held for Abigail, he could not fathom her plea for more consideration of women's issues.
As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We've been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented.
In 1797, John Adams was elected the second president of the United States, and Abigail was the first lady to live in the White House. And although the ideals that launched the new nation were ambitious, the exclusion of women in the political dialogue continued. Although independence from England had been won, the fruits of freedom were not enjoyed by all. Women and African Americans did not share the same rights as the men who drafted the laws of this new nation. Therefore, their struggles for equality had just begun.
It wasn't that long ago that women of all races and men of color were objects. They were owned like tables and chairs. They were not people, they were not citizens, they were not voters. It took 150 years of very deep struggle and bringing the country to a halt and a civil war and everything else to gain a legal identity as human beings for women of all races.
The leaders who emerged in the 1840s as the champions for women's rights were a few educated, dedicated fighters. Women's rights activists such as Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton knew that society and laws must change if women were to move forward.
Stanton and Mott became fast friends, and years later, in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, with many children and a not very happy marriage, was living in western New York State when Lucretia Mott came to visit her sister at Seneca Falls. And the two women got together for the first time in about 10 years since meeting in London, and they decided to have a meeting of women, which is the origins of the American women's suffrage movement.
In 1848, Stanton, Mott, and other activists held the now famous Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. At the Seneca Falls Convention, the women adopted a Declaration of Sentiments, which demanded that women receive all rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. The major thrust of these social reformers was for the abolition of laws denying women their property rights and other legal constraints. But the biggest push was for the right to vote. And in that battle, one name stands above the others.
Susan B. Anthony, through her temperance work, met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1852. From that point on, she dove into the women's suffrage movement and into the early women's rights movement and dedicated the rest of her life to it.
Starting with 1850, she devoted her energies to the women's movement, which included, at its core, abolition, criticism of slavery, and a concern with temperance. She, in those other two movements, she never became as visible or as outspoken a figure. She was sort of one of the women in the trenches in these battles, but she never assumed the leadership that she did in the women's movement. The difference was that in the women's movement, she was both one of the executive leaders in terms of making decisions and calling meetings, etc., but she was also one of the leading writers.
And for the next 50 years, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony worked together to achieve the right for a woman to vote in America. In 1866, when the 14th Amendment granted the right to vote to black men, but denied the same rights to women, Susan B. Anthony was outraged.
There shall never be another season of silence until women have the same rights men have on this green earth.
Within the women's movement, there were battles over strategy and how fast and far to push the male politicians. Some activists held out for a slower course. Susan B. Anthony advocated fiercely for full reform at the earliest possible date and lobbied state legislatures for years to get property law reforms so women could control their assets. After decades of struggle, it became clear to the women of the National American Woman Suffrage Association that the only way to gain the vote was a constitutional amendment. Congress, the Supreme Court, and the two major political parties were still hostile, but the women fought on.
She was politically convinced of the rightness of her cause, and she felt that if she didn't do this, no one would do it, and the cause would die. And she was probably to a large extent right.
In the last decades of her life, Susan B. Anthony and Stanton wrote their highly acclaimed record of their struggles, titled The History of Woman Suffrage. And Anthony continued her hectic schedule, never wavering from her goal of seeing women get the right to vote. At the age of 86, she declared to a suffrage convention in Baltimore,
"I'm here for a little time only. Then my place will be filled. The fight must not cease. You must see that it does not stop. Failure is impossible."
Susan B. Anthony died in her home in Rochester in 1906, 14 years before her dream would come true. By 1900, the National American Woman Suffrage Association had succeeded in persuading the Wyoming legislature to grant the right for women to vote in local elections. By 1912, 9 states had granted women the same rights. But the real challenge was the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would enable all American women to vote. New leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul advocated militant strategies such as mass marches and hunger strikes to help turn the tide. Congress was beginning to get the message. Meanwhile, another kind of activism was being seen. The Industrial Revolution during the 19th century had changed the face of America greatly. Jobs that had been done at home for centuries were now being performed in factories and small shops. Working-class women filled these new jobs and brought home something new, a paycheck. But this shift from an agricultural economy to an industrial one did not empower women workers.
Factory workers, very frequently women, would, for instance, be locked into the room in which they worked. And there would be no ventilation in that because if they were, for instance, making textiles, it was thought that the fresh air was not helpful in the making of textiles. You wanted hot, damp air or the threads would break. So the windows would be sealed and then the women would be locked into the room so that they couldn't go to the bathroom. And there would be factory fires. There was a major factory fire in New York City, for instance, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, in which dozens and dozens of women burned to death because they were locked into rooms that burst into fire.
150 women and girls perished in the blaze. People were outraged. Thousands of mourners marched in the streets of New York City to demonstrate the need to improve working conditions.
Well, I think that one of the things that's really important to realize is how active women were indirectly in politics throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century, and the extent to which women especially were involved in creating the educational and social welfare infrastructure of America.
At that time, America had become a haven of hope for millions of immigrants seeking a better life. Since no government agencies were created to help them, a few brave women took it upon themselves to aid the masses. In the heart of Chicago's worst slums, Jane Addams established the first settlement house, Hull House, in an effort to improve the lives of America's newest citizens.
Jane Addams was certainly one of the most important women during her lifetime, a very influential person. She started Hull House in 1889, and out of this institution she built a reputation for caring about human welfare on many levels.
Other women took up her cause, creating settlement houses in other major cities.
These were women-defined institutions which were formed by people like Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, where women who were college graduates but really had no careers to go into because the society did not provide for careers for them, came together to live together in houses in, for the most part, inner city areas of Chicago, New York, Boston, etc., to try to deal with the problems of the immigrant populations and the health problems of malnutrition and of poor factory conditions, and to work with the people in the neighborhood to try to make their lives better and different.
The area that Jane Addams and her fellow progressives had the most impact was in child labor laws, which outlawed hiring anyone under age 16 and limited the number of hours a laborer could work. It was a monumental effort and took years to accomplish.
It was the beginning of an effort to get a national child labor law passed, and Hull House people and settlement house people in general were really the pioneers in that effort. They were the spearheads of the whole effort to establish child labor legislation.
The settlement house movement attracted some of the best educated and creative women in the country, and that in turn helped politicize the process of national reform in laws concerning women and children. One of the earliest supporters of the settlement house approach for helping cure societal ills was Eleanor Roosevelt, a niece of President Theodore Roosevelt and the wife of future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Eleanor Roosevelt begins in the settlement house movement. She is part of the Remington Street settlement in New York in 1903. She really gets activated politically by that settlement house experience with other women. She's very active with the Women's Trade Union League, which is trying to organize women workers in the textile and garment factories. She's very much involved in working toward developing more inclusive women's organizations that are much fairer to immigrant women and black women and things like that. So that she is commanding a major political presence herself in the late 1920s, well before her husband is elected president.
A number of forces finally came together to make the political and judicial establishment see the light. The social climate in America had sufficiently changed to favor the vote for women. Activism won the day, and the 19th Amendment passed in June of 1919 and was ratified by the states and became the law of the land in August 1920.
With the vote in 1920, great changes occurred because we had the power of the franchise. We could make our vote count.
Maggie Kuhn, a lifelong activist, remembers that historic day.
I can remember my mother and I went to the polling place and voted. It's as clear as a day in my mind. I always remember it and be grateful for it.
The rights that we have now are entirely due to the people who fought for them. Things don't happen automatically. They happen because we make them happen. So the idea that women of all races and men of color are counted as citizens and human beings is entirely due to the abolitionist movement against slavery and the suffragist movement for the rights of women of all races.
With suffrage enacted, many women believed the battle to be over. In reality, winning the right to vote was just the first step in a long journey toward social and political equality. The Great Depression of the 1930s stifled any significant job creation for women. But the onset of World War II turned out to be a watershed for economic and social advancement for women.
World War II is one of those occasions when a whole lot of things get turned upside down. Throughout the 1930s, for example, you have a situation where women who are married are being prohibited from working. Teachers are made to leave their jobs if they get married. More than 75% of the school systems in the country will not hire a woman to teach if she's married. Well, suddenly the war happens, and you've got over 13 million soldiers being drafted. You have a major problem of providing the munition. You suddenly have a complete reversal in attitude and policy toward women work. So you've got this extraordinary experience that within a 5-year period from 1940 to 1945, you've got a 57% increase in the female labor force.
But when the men came home from war, women were strongly encouraged to leave their jobs and go back to their traditional roles.
The problem was that 80% of those women who'd taken jobs wanted to stay on the job. They enjoyed working, they enjoyed being paid, they enjoyed the camaraderie of being together with other women and men in the workforce. And so you have this kind of cultural schizophrenia, which develops all during the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, in which, on the one hand, you have what Betty Friedan calls the feminine mystique, the whole notion that home engineering is the highest profession women can aspire to, that building a home, in the words of one McCall's magazine article, is an act of craftsmanship like creating a cathedral, and that any woman who wants to work is a feminist neurotic. The reality, of course, is that all during the 1950s, women's labor force participation is skyrocketing. Women's employment rates increasing 4 times faster than men's during the 1950s. They're not entering careers, they're not competing with men as engineers or doctors or lawyers. But what they're doing is taking jobs in sex-segregated occupations like clerical work or sales work. And yet their work is absolutely indispensable toward the development of what we now call a middle-class lifestyle.
In the socially active 1960s, America witnessed a steady resurgence of the women's movement on many fronts. Civil rights demonstrations and protests against the war in Vietnam brought women activists to the forefront.
The civil rights movement creates a generation of women activists who have initially become involved in civil rights because they are committed as well to trying to end racial discrimination. And then they discovered that, in fact, even in the process of doing that, they are victims of sexual discrimination, even within the civil rights movement, by male leaders in the movement. They can be equals with men in marching down the street and facing police, but they're not asked to be part of the decision-making process. And so there's the development over time of the need to focus as much on issues of gender discrimination as on race discrimination.
Well, when I graduated from college in 1963, it was legal to discriminate against women. I mean, most people realize that it happened, but they forget that it was actually legal until the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, and gender. But many women found the social climate resisting their advancement. So in 1966, the National Organization for Women, NOW, was established to make certain that federal and state laws concerning sex discrimination were being enforced.
NOW focuses on things like abolishing the separate classified ads for female-only and male-only employment, abolishing the notion that women should not be allowed to drink in certain bars or eat in certain restaurants, attacking the whole assumption that careers, partnerships in law firms should be not available for women.
We have seen gradual changes, and a lot of them have been in connection to legislation and to civil rights laws and to litigation. That was the first wave, in a sense, of changes. If you might call it the women's eyes on the prize generation, was gaining access to things that were closed to them.
By the 1970s, the women's movement was in full swing. Women began to take charge of their bodies and their lives. Many younger women in particular felt this was the beginning of a new era, one that would usher in opportunities for personal and professional growth.
Under the impact of the women's movement and the civil rights movement, that changes dramatically. The applications from women to go to medical school accelerate by 400% or 500% within 5 years. So that from 5% in 1970, you go up to entering classes of 45% in 1990. A major difference. The same thing happens in law schools. The same thing happens in business schools.
But as the social tide turned more conservative in the 1980s, there was a backlash against the women's movement on many fronts. The media focus on reproductive rights overshadowed women's rights, and the Equal Rights Amendment, which was designed to grant women equality with men throughout society, was not ratified by the necessary number of state legislatures and died. Less sensational but no less turbulent was the ongoing struggle for advancement in the workplace, as many women in corporate America experienced the limitations of the so-called glass ceiling.
When I first started in business, I think we were all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and we believed that if we were educated properly, dressed right, talked right, and just behaved ourselves, we would eventually be accepted and make our way up through the layers. Well, it's now the mid-90s practically, and not so. It doesn't matter how well you're educated, dressed, or how well you talk. the glass ceiling is there and it seems to be intransigent. And so more and more women of a certain age are starting very exciting companies all over the country.
The fastest growing part of the economy are women-owned businesses. And to me, that's a lot of good news. And there's a little questionable news. It's good news because these women have a lot of personal sense of power and entrepreneurial spirit, and they feel good about taking something on and doing it, which I think is terrific. The bad news, to a certain extent, is a number of these women are fed up with the corporations they worked for. That in order to do their jobs, they had to hassle so much in a rigid and by and large male structure that too much of their energy was going to coping with the corporation, not enough of it was going to business. And so a lot of the best and the brightest of a generation of women have left the IBMs, you know, because they don't want to deal with it.
Professor, do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
In the early 1990s, attention shifted to the political arena during the highly publicized Supreme Court confirmation hearings for Clarence Thomas. Many women were outraged by the treatment of Anita Hill, a former employee who accused him of sexual harassment. The Anita Hill-Clarence Thomas hearings proved to be a catalyst for many women seeking political office in 1992, a year that was called the Year of the Woman.
This is the year of the woman, because this is the year of change. Thank you.
A record number of women were elected to public office in 1992. Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent Anna Quinlan, formerly of the New York Times, puts the recent years into perspective.
The changes have been huge. I mean, I just went back and looked at statistics for 1973, exactly 20 years ago. There were no women in the Senate, and there were 12 women in the House of Representatives, and Pat Nixon was the First Lady. To just look at Carol Moseley Braun and Hillary Clinton and Janet Reno in light of those figures shows how far we've traveled in terms of role models for women and for men.
And there are many other battles still to be waged.
I do think that the movements of the first wave continue now. It isn't as if they stopped. They continue in different ways. So where we were fighting for the vote, say, in the 19th century and early 20th century, we are now fighting for reproductive freedom, for the right to decide whether and when to have children. So we have the right to have children and not to have children. Until we control our lives from the skin in, we aren't going to have a very easy time controlling our lives from the skin out.
The future of the women's movement in America is full of opportunity and promise. Never before have women had so many legal rights. Yet never before have those rights been under attack by those who want to confine the roles of women in society. Huge strides have been made, but pressure will always have to be exerted in order to ensure the rights of all women in America.
Most of us have learned that women's position in life is not due to biology or Freud or God. It's due to politics in the deepest sense of politics. And similarly, men and women of color, their position is not due to any racial theory of intelligence or whatever, or separation of the races. It's due to a system of power. And the minute you realize that, the minute you realize that there's hope, that there's change, that there's a future that can be different.